Rajni, what's wrong?
Tom, I have a script and I don't know what to do with it. Should I burn it? Feed it to my cat?
You need some writers group therapy.
Hello and welcome to Writers Group Therapy.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Roshni. We're writers helping writers. Are you ready for your session? The doctors are in. Okay, so this is like writing 101, but I asked you this question when I was working on different fellowship entries. Serialized versus procedural. Let's start with a definition.
Definition. Oh, so a serialized show is one that has the major portion of the episodes is about an ongoing story that goes from episode to episode, like a Game of Thrones or Walking Dead, where if you were to watch it out of order, you would totally be confused as to what's happening next or what happened before it. You really need to see them in order. Whereas a procedural is something that has a more I guess you would call it a formalized structure to it. You know, the characters don't change much from episode to episode. They may have a long arc, but you come into each episode and it's pretty much next day at work and what are we working on today? A lot of crime dramas like CSI, NCIS, medical dramas, Chicago Hope, ER, they're all mostly procedural, where the doctors come to work, they save patients' lives, and then they go home. And they have some of their own personal lives in there as an overarching story. But from a day-to-day episode type thing, you can pretty much watch an episode and pretty much know what's going on.
Yeah, whenever I hear serialized versus procedural, I always think like cop procedure, like protocol. I always think of like your CSIs and your NCISs and your Law and Orders and Major Crimes, and those are all like the cop shows, right? So I always think of that for procedural. But it's interesting because we were looking at this article on, how do you tell if it's procedural versus serialized? And one of the main points they brought up was you can watch a procedural out of order. If it's, in syndication, you can watch something from season 7, you can watch something from season 1, and you don't really miss a lot. Versus a serialized thing, like say 24, or what else is, Lost, that builds upon each other. Breaking Bad, you're like, if you watch it out of order, you're like, what did I miss? Game of Thrones, you can't watch an episode from season 4 and then season 1 and understand what's happening. You've missed the entire story. So that got me thinking, how do you classify comedy?
Well, comedies, generally, I think you would have to classify them as procedural because from episode to episode, the characters really don't change much. They kind of start every episode with, okay, what's the problem of the day? Jerry and Elaine and George kind of like whatever's bugging them that day, and then it kind of evolves into whatever the story is. But every episode kind of starts off with like, oh, well, what's it about this?
It's an interesting question because everywhere I researched to figure out because I was submitting a comedy, and the question was, is it serialized? Is it procedural? And I'm like, good question. And everywhere I researched what is serialized, what is procedural, they reference dramas, but they don't reference comedies.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I was trying to think of a comedy that was serialized, and the only one I could come up with was Arrested Development, because that's really a story that's about the family and they're trying to survive this family crisis of their father's making and all the characters. They go through individual stories in each episode, but really they do build on each other and kind of lead to a climax. In fact, when they did I think it was for Netflix, did an original season after it was canceled, they did a season of it. They filmed it where each episode was the same, period of time, but from different characters' perspective. So it was so serialized that you had to watch all the episodes before you understood what was going on even in the first episode, because they were all overlapping stories and they all connected. So it was very much of a serialized kind of story.
It's an interesting question because I remember when we first had this debate, you said, a comedy would be serialized because they have those overarching storylines. And I thought, wouldn't they be procedural though? Because when you watch them in syndication, you can watch them out of order. And just now you're like, oh, I think they'd be procedural. So why did you change your mind on that?
Well, it was just like what you said. If you within a season, you can usually watch them in any order. But like even Seinfeld, George gets engaged to Susan, and I can't remember what season it was. But if you watch that and then you went back to watch something in season 1 or 2 when he's single, you would be like, well, where'd Susan go? So there are serialized components to all these stories. It's almost like it's a percentage kind of thing. Not anything is totally 100% serialized and nothing's totally 100% procedural. No matter how little your characters change, there's always some sort of change in their life, or sometimes the cast changes too. Or you have recurring characters that come in at various times and have ongoing stories when they pop back in. So there's always a component that's a little bit serialized, but primarily they're procedural because you can watch most of them, out of order.
It does make me wonder if maybe only certain things like drama could ever fall in that category. Because, for example, animation. There's a lot of animated shows that I can think of that, again, if I watch them out of order, I don't really miss much.
No, they're pretty procedural. The gummy bears come out of their hole and go on an adventure, and then they, run into a problem. Then they solve the problem, and everyone lives happily ever after, and they start all over the next episode. So
yeah. I mean, there might be some. I'm thinking My Little Pony, my favorite cartoon. Obviously you might watch something in season 5 and go, oh look, she's got wings. And then, you watch season 1, you go, Twilight Sparkle doesn't have wings. What happened? That might be the only thing where you're like, I don't get it. But a lot of them are self-contained and don't necessarily build upon the previous episode, which is what I think the whole point of a serialized show is, right? They build upon the previous episode. So a soap opera would totally be serialized, but a cartoon would probably be procedural.
Yeah, soap operas are like ultra serialized. Like each episode's like 5 minutes of real time, and the next one is like the next 5 minutes, and they're so built on each other. They take so long to get through a story. It's like when watching like real life in slow motion. So,
but again, a soap opera would be classified as a drama, not a comedy. So.
Even dramas, though, do have, percentages of serialized versus procedural. I wrote a TV pilot, and it was like an action TV pilot. And I looked at other shows that were similar to it, and to try to figure out like how much does this compare to it. And I looked at things like Burn Notice and Leverage and Person of Interest, and all those shows had like, let's save somebody this week, but then we have our ongoing problem we're trying to solve for ourselves that goes from week to week. So those had a little bit more of a serialized nature. I would say like 80-20. So they were like 80% procedural, where you could watch any episode and watch that A story, unfold and be resolved. But then that B or C story was always there, kind of the longer story, that usually kind of came up at the very beginning, kind of came up at the very end, and maybe somewhere in the middle was a little dash of it, but it was much more subtle. It was kind of like that little nagging thing in the back of your mind you got to deal with while you're dealing with today's problem.
Now, here's an interesting question then also. With shows moving to things like Netflix and Hulu and everything, like for example, Handmaid's Tale, they released, was it Handmaid's Tale? Did they release the whole season? There was one, no, maybe it wasn't Handmaid's
That was a binge watch it. Yeah, the whole thing. Stranger Things was another one.
The whole season. So would the whole serialized versus procedural question even be relevant if they're going to release the whole season?
Well, those are just totally serialized. But see, some of those like Stranger Things, I liken that to watching just a really long movie, because it's really all one storyline. There's a big A story. They have smaller stories between some of the characters, but there's hardly anything procedural about them. They're just totally like you're watching a movie, and it just keeps going for 8 or 10 or 12 hours. That was kind of like when you watched 24. 24 is probably the most serialized drama on TV, because literally one episode leads right to the next episode. You watch those out of order, like you said, and you've missed something completely. You'd be completely confused. So I see those as like more like movie-esque type productions even.
But my point is, if you need to know if your show is serialized or procedural in order to pitch it, and you're putting it on a streaming service where they're just going to release the whole thing anyway.
Well, that's a whole discussion about the TV industry and how they're changing, because they do film those all at once and then release them all at once. They did the same thing with things like Downton Abbey. That was a very, all serialized show. They wrote the whole show. Julian Fellows, who created Downton Abbey, he would write every episode. He wrote the entire season. Then they went and filmed it, and then they put it out. But they put that out week by week, actually. But they still did it that way, so it was still very serialized. In our modern TV, in our broadcast type TV world, they're still doing 22, 24 weeks where they've got a writer's room, and they're breaking the stories week after week. They don't know exactly where it's going themselves until they get to somewhere down the road. They have to break the stories in the writer's room. So part of that serialization is, and the procedural nature of it is, so that they can get out all those episodes. So if you're doing a shorter series, you don't have to be episodic because you're telling the one main story. Whereas if you're doing 20, 22 episodes, you have to be somewhat procedural, because that's the only way to get that many stories written in such a short period of time, to have a formula.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So what do you guys think on the debate of serialized versus procedural? Where do comedies and cartoons fall? We need to figure out this debate. So let us know. Tweet it at us at WG Therapy. You can also check us out online at writersgrouptherapy.com. And if you like what you hear, subscribe and share it with your friends. We'll see you next week.